In the aftermath of the outbreak, America had been transformed into a desolate wasteland. Cities, once filled with life and laughter, were now empty shells, their streets littered with debris and broken dreams. Survivors, few and far between, wandered through the ruins, fighting to stay alive in a world overrun by the undead. Yet, in this new world, every inch of land was a battleground, and the struggle to survive wasn't just about avoiding zombies, it was about claiming what little remained of civilization. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Jake, a hardened survivor, gazed out across the abandoned town. His once thriving hometown was now just another piece of a decaying world. His group of survivors had been holed up in an old high school for the past few months, making it their base of operations. But today, they had a plan. It was time to take back the land that had been lost. "Ready for the fight?" asked Sarah, a fellow survivor, as she adjusted her backpack, ensuring her rifle was within reach. Jake nodded, his expression grim. "We can't keep hiding forever. We need to clear the surrounding areas if we're going to survive. The zombies aren't getting any quieter, and our food supply is running low." The school, surrounded by a high iron fence, had become their sanctuary, but it was a fragile one. Every day, they heard the haunting moans of the undead in the distance, drawing closer with each passing hour. For Jake, Sarah, and the others, it was time to take the offensive. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but survival was about making bold moves in a world where weakness was a death sentence. The first objective was a nearby grocery store, small, but crucial for resupplying their dwindling stockpile. It wasn't just the zombies that were a threat, other survivors, desperate and dangerous, had begun to infiltrate the area. While most of the population had been wiped out by the virus, the ones that remained had turned into ruthless scavengers, willing to kill anyone for a scrap of food or a safe place to sleep. Jake and his team, a mix of skilled fighters and resourceful individuals, moved silently through the streets, their eyes scanning every shadow for movement. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind and the distant groans of the undead. The city had fallen into an unnatural stillness, as if even time itself had slowed down in the face of such overwhelming destruction. As they approached the grocery store, Jake signaled for them to stop. There were no visible zombies in sight, but that didn't mean it was safe. Sarah crouched low, her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the area. No sign of anything. "Let's move fast." With the store only a few hundred yards away, the group advanced cautiously, making sure to stay out of sight. Their every step was calculated, their senses heightened. The slightest mistake could be their last. They reached the store's parking lot without incident. Jake motioned for them to spread out and check the perimeter. The group moved quickly, securing the area and ensuring there were no immediate threats. But the tension in the air was palpable. They knew the real danger wasn't just the zombies, it was the unpredictable nature of the world they now lived in. People would kill for the smallest advantage, and the survivors that remained weren't always friendly. "All clear," Sarah whispered as she peered through the glass doors of the store. "Let's go." Jake nodded and led the way, pushing open the door with a creak. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, but there were still some cans of food and bottles of water left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them for another week, maybe two. They quickly set to work, grabbing anything that could be useful. Just as they were about to leave, a noise from the back of the store caught their attention. A loud crash echoed through the aisles, followed by the unmistakable sound of groaning. Zombies. Dozens of them, drawn to the noise, began stumbling toward the group. "Move! Now!" Jake yelled, pushing everyone toward the exit. They scrambled for the door, but before they could reach it, the glass shattered. A group of zombies had already reached the store, and the survivors were trapped. Panic surged through the group, but Jake's calm voice cut through the chaos. "Stay together. We fight our way out." Jake led the charge, using his machete to clear a path as the others followed close behind. The groaning grew louder, and the undead began closing in from all sides. The group fought fiercely, their weapons clashing with the decaying bodies of the zombies. Every swing of Jake's machete felt like a desperate prayer for survival. With one final push, they broke through the crowd of zombies, emerging into the parking lot. The team sprinted back to their school base, their hearts pounding in their chests. The world outside had turned into a war zone, but for now, they had fought and survived another day. As they reached the safety of their sanctuary, Jake couldn't help but think about the battles yet to come. The fight for every inch of land was just beginning. "Tomorrow, we go further," Jake said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "This land is ours, and we're not giving it up without a fight." The others nodded in agreement. They knew the world had changed, but they would fight to the bitter end, claiming every inch of land, one battle at a time. The survivors had barely caught their breath when Jake gathered the group in the school's main hall. The aftermath of the grocery store skirmish weighed heavily on their minds. The fight for food had come at a steep price, and while they had won, they were now more vulnerable than ever. The zombies were relentless, and worse still, humans could be just as dangerous. Every inch of land had become a battleground, and the school, their last sanctuary, was no exception. "We can't stay here forever," Jake said, his voice serious but calm, his hand resting on the map spread across the table in front of him. "We need to secure a better position. The zombies are getting closer, and more scavengers will come. We need a place we can defend." "A fortress." The group exchanged looks, knowing Jake was right. No place was safe, but with every passing day, it felt like the world was shrinking. The fight was no longer just about surviving the apocalypse, it was about outlasting everything that stood in their way, whether it was the undead or the remaining survivors. Sarah, ever the optimist, stepped forward. "There's an old farm outside of town. It's got high fences, plenty of crops, and it's isolated. If we can make it there, we'll have a chance." Jake looked up at her, studying her face. She had become one of the strongest members of their group, reliable in ways he hadn't expected. "How far?" "It's a couple of miles. We've got enough fuel to make it there, but it won't be an easy trip. We'll have to be quick." "Then we go now," Jake decided. "We'll make it a straight shot. We'll grab anything else we can carry and head out before nightfall." Without wasting another second, the group began to prepare. They gathered their weapons, checked their supplies, and ensured that every person was ready for the journey. The air felt thick with tension, and even though they had fought zombies together before, this time felt different. Every step into the unknown was a risk, and they were all keenly aware of how quickly things could go wrong. Once they were ready, they moved out, sticking to the streets, moving quietly, using alleys and abandoned buildings as cover. The closer they got to the outskirts of town, the more uneasy they became. Zombies roamed the streets, their presence ever constant, a grim reminder that there was no escape from the relentless tide of the undead. The first sign of trouble came when they rounded a corner and saw a group of survivors standing by a crumbling gas station. These weren't the same kind of survivors they had been, organized and focused on a goal. Instead, this group was ragged, desperate, their eyes hollow from days, maybe weeks, of struggle. Jake knew right away that these were the kind of people who would take what they could, no questions asked. One of them, a man wearing a torn leather jacket, spotted the survivors. His hand immediately went to the handgun strapped to his waist, his fingers twitching with impatience. "Hold it! This is our territory now," the man called out, his voice harsh and commanding. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the machete at his side. "We're just passing through," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We don't want trouble." Sarah, standing behind him, scanned the surroundings. She was already calculating their chances, weighing the options. The tension between both groups was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Jake. "No one passes through without paying a toll," the man said, a sneer forming on his lips. Jake didn't flinch. "We don't have anything to give." "Then you'll have to make a trade," the man growled, taking a step closer, his fingers tightening around the gun. In an instant, everything changed. A rustling from behind them caught Jake's attention, and his instincts kicked in. "Zombies!" he shouted, pointing toward the alley just behind the gas station. The group of survivors turned at the same time Jake's team did, all of them momentarily distracted by the sight of the approaching undead. It was enough of an opening. Without warning, Jake lunged forward, closing the distance between him and the man with the gun. He knocked the gun away, the blade of his machete flashing in the light. The man stumbled back, disoriented, and his companions began to draw weapons. But there was no time for a fight. The zombies were closing in quickly. "Run!" Jake ordered. He turned and sprinted toward the edge of the parking lot, his team following close behind. As they raced toward the open road, they could hear the frantic shouts from the scavengers as the zombies began to close in on them, their hungry groans growing louder with every passing second. Sarah's heart raced as they pushed forward, the image of the scavengers group caught in the tide of zombies burned into her mind. For a moment, she thought about stopping to help, but she knew it would only put them in danger. They had to keep moving, no matter what. The road to the farm was perilous. The group fought to keep their pace as the undead stalked them from every side. Sarah's breath was coming in short gasps as she glanced back, her hands gripping the rifle tightly. "Just a little further," Jake urged, his eyes scanning the horizon. The farm was just ahead, a tiny silhouette in the distance. The group pushed harder, adrenaline surging, as they fought for every inch of ground. They couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to look back. The farm was the only chance they had, and they weren't about to let it slip through their fingers. As they neared the farm's high fences, they could see the faint outline of the barn. They were almost there. They could hear the distant groans of the undead closing in, but they weren't stopping. Not now. And with a final burst of energy, they reached the farm gate. It was time to make their stand, and they weren't about to lose this battle, not today. The gate to the farm creaked open, its rusted hinges protesting under the strain. Jake led the group through, ensuring they didn't waste any time lingering at the threshold. The safety of the high fences loomed in front of them like a promise, one they could almost touch. The farm was their only hope, the sanctuary they'd risked everything to find. Once they were inside, Jake quickly turned to Sarah, giving her a nod of approval. "Secure the perimeter. Check for any signs of danger," he instructed, his voice firm. Sarah was already on it, moving swiftly towards the outer fence, scanning every corner for possible threats. The rest of the group took refuge inside the barn, the heavy doors locking behind them. The sense of relief was immediate, but it was short-lived. The air was thick with tension, and the silence inside the barn only amplified the feeling. They had made it, but the battle was far from over. They had secured a temporary refuge, but now they needed to fortify it, and quickly. "We'll need to rebuild the fence," Jake said, turning to the others. "Make it stronger. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that these zombies never stop. They'll find a way in, given time." Ben, a former carpenter, stepped forward. "I can help with that," he said, adjusting his belt. "We've got enough wood from the old sheds, and I can reinforce the gate." Jake nodded. "Good. Let's make it count." As the group got to work on reinforcing the gate and adding extra barriers along the fence, the reality of their situation began to settle in. There was no more running. They had reached the farm, but there was no guarantee it would stay safe for long. They would need to defend it, every inch, every corner. The farm's isolation was its greatest strength, but it also made it vulnerable to attack. They couldn't afford to be complacent. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow across the landscape. The undead would soon be out in full force, and their movements grew more erratic with the nightfall. From the barn, they could see the first signs of the horde gathering at the outskirts of the farm, drawn by the sounds of human activity. Groaning filled the air, a chilling reminder that the dead were always out there, waiting for a chance to strike. The faint smell of decay lingered in the wind, making it impossible to forget that the world they once knew had ended. "Here they come," Sarah called out, her voice tight with urgency as she returned to the barn. "We've got at least a dozen, maybe more. And they're getting closer." Jake turned to the group, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The zombies were coming. They had no time to waste. "We need to hold the line," he said, his tone sharp and determined. "Get your weapons ready. If they get inside, we're done." We fight, we survive. Each person nodded in agreement, and within moments, the group was armed and ready. Ben carried a makeshift spear, Sarah had her rifle, and Jake gripped his machete, his trusty blade that had already seen him through countless battles. They took up their positions along the edge of the barn, the gate their only line of defense. The first few zombies appeared at the far edge of the property, stumbling through the tall grass, their hollow eyes searching for any sign of life. As they neared the farm's entrance, their numbers seemed to grow. The dead never traveled alone. They were always in packs, lured by scent, sound, or movement. Jake's pulse quickened. He'd fought the undead countless times, but there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about protecting everything they had left. He wasn't sure how long they could hold out, but there was no turning back now. A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees just beyond the farm. More zombies. This time, the horde had come from multiple directions. They're everywhere, Ben muttered under his breath. We can't let them breach the fence. If they do, we'll be sitting ducks. Jake surveyed the area. The fence was their first line of defense, but the zombies were closing in fast. If the undead reached the farm's walls, it would be a nightmare. The team had to act fast. We need to split up, Jake said, his mind racing through their options. Sarah, take the left side. Ben, you're with me on the right. The rest of you, stay by the gate and watch for any that try to slip through. We need to keep them at bay long enough to finish reinforcing the fence. Without hesitation, the group moved into position. The night was alive with the sound of the undead's moans, their dragging footsteps growing louder as they approached. The battle was imminent. Sarah raised her rifle, her gaze focused on the oncoming horde. I'll pick off the stragglers, she called, her voice steady despite the danger. You guys handle the rest. Jake gave her a nod of acknowledgement and turned toward the right side of the farm. The zombies were closing in from all angles, but he could see the faint outlines of their twisted forms through the gloom. His machete felt heavier in his hand as he steeled himself for the fight. The first wave hit quickly. Zombies crashed against the makeshift barriers, their decaying hands reaching for anything they could grab. Jake and Ben slashed through the first few, their weapons cutting through the air with precision. The stink of decay and death was overwhelming, but they pressed on, taking out the undead one by one. But the horde wasn't backing down. For every zombie they killed, more seemed to appear from the shadows, emerging from every corner of the farm. The battle was far from over. This is only the beginning, Jake thought to himself as he swung his machete at another approaching zombie. His pulse was pounding in his ears. The fight for every inch of land had begun, and they would have to fight for every inch until the very end. The sounds of battle echoed through the night as Jake's group fought to hold their ground. Each swing of the machete, each shot from Sarah's rifle, felt like they were pushing against an unstoppable tide. The zombies were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. No matter how many they took down, more seemed to take their place, crawling from the darkness like an endless swarm. Jake's arms were starting to feel the strain, but he couldn't afford to stop. The undead were closing in on all sides. The barricades they had hurriedly put together were already beginning to buckle under the weight of the horde. The sound of wood splintering filled the air, adding a sense of urgency to their already perilous situation. Hold them off. We can't let them get inside. Jake shouted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Ben was beside him, swinging his makeshift spear with all his might, taking down one zombie after another. But even his efforts couldn't slow the advance of the growing horde. I'm trying. Ben grunted, his face grim as he jabbed his spear into a zombie's chest. But there were too many, and with every passing second, it felt like the wall between life and death was growing thinner. Jake's eyes darted to Sarah, who was still firing from the left flank. Her rifle shots rang out with deadly precision, each one finding its mark, but even she couldn't keep up with the zombies' endless numbers. We need more time, Sarah called, a hint of desperation in her voice. If we don't finish reinforcing the fence, we're done for. Jake's gaze hardened. Time was the one thing they didn't have. We won't last long if they keep pushing like this, he said through gritted teeth. We need to fall back and regroup. If we don't, we'll be overrun. Just as Jake was about to signal the retreat, a loud crash echoed through the night. He turned sharply to see one of the barricades collapsing entirely under the weight of the zombies. A dozen undead broke through the opening and poured into the farmyard, their grotesque, decaying forms silhouetted in the dim light of the barn. "We've lost the right side," Ben shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Fall back to the barn. Now," he ordered. The group moved quickly, retreating to the barn's entrance with the undead hot on their heels. Every moment was a race against death. They fired shots, took down the stragglers, but it was clear the situation was becoming dire. The once secure farm was now under siege. Inside the barn, the group quickly shut the large doors behind them, their heavy thud echoing throughout the dim interior. Jake leaned against the door, catching his breath, his heart still hammering in his chest. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "They'll just keep coming." The group gathered inside the barn, all of them looking to Jake for answers. Their faces were grim, covered in sweat and grime, but there was no time for rest. Every second felt like it could be their last. "We need a new plan," Jake said, his mind already racing through their limited options. "We can't stay here forever. If they break through those doors, we're done." "We can't fight them all off," Sarah said, wiping sweat from her brow. "There's too many of them. We need to get out, regroup, and find a safer place." Jake nodded slowly. "Agreed. But where?" The thought of leaving the farm was terrifying. It was the only place they had managed to secure, but staying here was even riskier. The zombies were relentless, and with every passing day, it seemed like more were being drawn to the area. They had to move, but the question was, where could they go that was any safer? The farm's location had been an advantage at first, isolated, hidden away from the chaos of the city. But now it seemed like that same isolation had become a curse. The undead weren't the only danger in this world anymore. The desperation of other survivors was just as deadly. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang against the barn doors. The zombies were at it again, hammering on the wood with an insistent fury. It was only a matter of time before they broke through. "We need to make a run for it," Jake said, looking around at the group. "We'll make a break for the tree-line. Once we're in the woods, we can lose them. They won't be able to track us." "I don't like it," Ben replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "The woods are dangerous. It'll be hard to see them coming." "We don't have a choice," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "If we stay here, we die. We have to move now." The group exchanged tense glances, but they all knew Jake was right. They didn't have the luxury of choosing comfort or safety. They needed to survive, and that meant taking risks. "All right, let's move," Sarah said, gripping her rifle tighter. "We'll stay close, keep our heads down. Stick together." Jake gave a sharp nod, his eyes scanning the barn one last time. The walls were shaking as the zombies hammered at the doors. They didn't have much time left. With a final glance at the barricaded entrance, Jake led the group out of the barn. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, using the barn's tall walls as cover. The night air was thick with the sound of groaning zombies and the rustle of trees in the distance. They reached the edge of the woods, the dark silhouettes of the trees looming in front of them. The group paused for a moment, their breaths shallow with anticipation. "On my count," Jake said, his voice low. 1, 2, 3. And they ran. The moment they stepped into the woods, the sounds of the world outside faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. They moved quickly, knowing that every step could be their last. The trees offered some cover, but it also meant they were at the mercy of whatever dangers lurked in the shadows. Behind them, the zombies were still pounding at the barn doors. But soon, the group was far enough into the forest that they couldn't hear them anymore. For now, they had escaped. But how long would it last? As the group pressed on through the dense woods, their only hope was that they would find somewhere safe. Somewhere they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. And the night was far from over. The forest loomed dark and oppressive as the survivors pressed forward, their eyes straining to see through the shadows. The faint light from the moon barely filtered through the dense canopy above, casting eerie patterns on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a warning. Jake kept his hand firmly gripped around his machete, its worn hilt a small comfort in the midst of the unknown. His mind raced as he led the group through the woods. They had barely escaped the farm, and he knew that the danger wasn't over. The zombies had been relentless, but they were also slow and mindless. The true threat now was the unpredictable wilderness and the unknown dangers it held. They had to keep moving. There was no turning back. "How far do you think we've gone?" Ben asked, breaking the silence, his voice low as he glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Far enough for now," Jake replied, not looking back. "But we need to find shelter soon. We can't keep running all night." The group had fallen into a steady, tense rhythm as they navigated the forest. Every step was calculated, every breath held as they moved deeper into the woods. They couldn't afford to make noise or draw attention. Sarah led the way, her rifle slung over her shoulder, scanning the area around them. "We should find a place to set up camp. I don't like the idea of moving around in the dark." "I agree," Jake said. "We'll stop soon, but only for a few hours. We can't waste too much time." They continued on, weaving through the dense trees, every sound in the forest amplified by the silence that hung heavy between them. The only noises were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of creatures in the night. But there was an ever-present undercurrent of tension, the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. The moon had begun to rise higher, casting more light into the woods. The shadows were still deep, but there was enough light to see a few feet ahead. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some hope that they wouldn't walk blindly into another horde of zombies. Eventually, they came upon a small clearing, a modest break in the trees. The land was flat and covered with thick grass, offering them a place to rest and regroup. "This'll do for now," Jake said, pausing to take a look around. "It's not perfect, but it's better than wandering aimlessly." Ben set down his spear and dropped to the ground, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "I'm glad to be off my feet," he muttered, rubbing his aching muscles. Sarah remained standing, scanning the edges of the clearing, her rifle held at the ready. "We'll need to set up some kind of perimeter," she said, her tone cautious. "I don't trust being out in the open." Jake nodded. "Agreed. We'll take turns keeping watch. Sarah, you take the first shift. Ben, help me gather some firewood." Ben grumbled but got to his feet, his fatigue clearly taking its toll. They couldn't afford to rest for too long, but the exhaustion was weighing heavily on everyone. As Jake and Ben gathered drywood from the surrounding trees, the silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier. The occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves felt louder than it should. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The woods weren't just empty, something was out there. He just couldn't figure out what. After a few minutes, Ben broke the silence. "You think we're safe here? I mean, there's no sign of zombies, but I'm not feeling all that secure." Jake glanced over at Ben, his expression unreadable. "Safe? No, we're never really safe anymore. But this is the best we've got for now." As they finished gathering wood, the others began to settle in the clearing, their eyes scanning the darkness. Sarah took her position on a log, her back against a tree, rifle in hand, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. Jake sat down beside the fire that Ben had started, the flickering flames offering some warmth against the chill of the night air. The fire would help keep the zombies away, but it would also draw attention. It was a risk, but one they had to take. "So, what now?" Ben asked, sitting down beside the fire. "We can't keep running forever. We need to find a way to end this." Jake's eyes flickered to the fire, his mind wandering as he stared into the dancing flames. He thought about the farm, the life they had left behind, and the uncertain future ahead. They had no real plan, no clear idea of what lay beyond the next stretch of forest or what kind of world they were trying to survive in. "We keep moving forward," Jake said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "We find supplies, we find a better place to stay, and we keep pushing. We can't stop. If we stop, we die." There was a long pause as everyone absorbed his words, the weight of their new reality settling in once again. The fight for survival wasn't just about physical battles with the undead, it was about surviving in a world that no longer made sense, where every day felt like a battle for the smallest of victories. "We'll need to move at first light," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "We need to keep ahead of the zombies. And we have no idea what's waiting for us further on. If we're going to make it, we need to stick together." Jake nodded. He looked at each of them, Ben, Sarah, the others, and knew they were all thinking the same thing. They were survivors. They had made it this far, and they wouldn't stop now. "We'll stick together. And no matter what happens, we keep fighting," Jake said, his voice firm. The fire crackled, and for a moment, the group fell into a silence that felt almost peaceful, though they all knew it wouldn't last. They had come this far, but the road ahead was still uncertain. As the fire burned low, the shadows of the trees crept closer, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the darkness. But for now, all they could do was rest and prepare for whatever was coming next. The night was far from over. And in the morning, the fight would begin again. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the clearing, casting long shadows between the trees. The survivors stirred, their eyes heavy with sleep, but there was no time for rest. They knew that each day could be their last. The forest had been quiet during the night, but the eerie silence only heightened their sense of unease. Jake rose first, his body aching from the constant strain of survival. His hands gripped his machete as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in this new, violent world. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the clearing. No sign of the undead. But they knew better than to trust the quiet for long. "Everyone up," Jake called quietly, his voice low but commanding. "We need to move before the sun gets any higher." Ben groaned, rubbing his eyes as he stretched, his muscles protesting the effort. "How far do you think we've gone? Are we safe yet?" Jake didn't answer right away. They weren't safe. Not yet. But every mile they put between themselves and the farm gave them a bit more breathing room. The problem was, the farther they went, the more unfamiliar the world became. And the more dangerous it felt. "Just keep moving," Jake said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We can't stop now." Sarah was already up, checking her rifle and adjusting her pack. "We're sitting ducks if we stay here too long. Let's get going." Without another word, the group packed up their things and began to move deeper into the woods, following the narrow trail that Jake had found earlier. The trees were thick here, their branches intertwining high above, casting the forest floor in shadow. The ground was uneven and treacherous, forcing them to watch their every step. As they walked, the atmosphere grew heavier. The world around them felt both silent and alive in a way that made their nerves tingle. The forest was quiet, but the quiet felt wrong, too still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "How far do you think this goes?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced nervously at the trees around them. "I don't know," Jake replied. "But we can't afford to keep guessing. We just need to keep moving." For hours, they trekked through the dense forest. The sun rose higher, casting shafts of light through the trees, but still, the forest remained eerily quiet. Not a single bird sang. No animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire world had gone still, as if nature itself had been swallowed by the chaos that had consumed humanity. Sarah was the first to break the silence again. "This place gives me the creeps. It's too quiet." Jake couldn't disagree. The silence was unnerving. They had become so accustomed to the sound of their own footsteps, the crackling of the fire, and the distant groans of the undead that this absolute stillness felt almost unnatural. "I don't like it either," he admitted. "But we need to stay alert." Suddenly, a rustling sound echoed from the trees ahead. Everyone froze, their breath catching in their throats as their eyes darted around the clearing. The noise grew louder, the snapping of branches and the rustle of leaves becoming more distinct. Was it the wind? Or something else? Before Jake could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, tall and ragged, wearing a torn jacket and carrying a large pack slung over his shoulder. His eyes were wild, wide with fear, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. "Please," the man shouted, his voice hoarse. "I'm not one of them. Don't shoot." Jake's hand instinctively went to the grip of his machete, but he didn't draw it. The man was alone, and he didn't appear to be infected. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice steady, but his eyes never leaving the stranger. I'm a survivor," the man stammered, his eyes darting nervously to the trees behind him. "I've been running for days. I've seen the Horde. They're everywhere. Please, I need help." Jake exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who was now holding her rifle at the ready, her expression cautious. "Why are you out here alone?" Ben asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Where are the others?" The stranger shook his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There were others. But they didn't make it. I don't know how much longer I can last. Please, I need food, water, protection. I'll do anything. I just can't survive alone anymore." The desperation in the man's voice was palpable, and for a moment, Jake felt a pang of sympathy. But the cold, harsh reality of the world they lived in made him hesitant. They couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly. "We can't take you in," Jake said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We're already stretched thin as it is." The man's face crumpled in despair. "Please, you don't understand. If you leave me out here, I'll be dead by nightfall. The undead are closing in on me. I have nowhere to go." Jake's heart weighed heavy, torn between the need to help and the harsh necessity of survival. He could feel the eyes of his group on him, waiting for a decision. "We don't have room for anyone else," Sarah said, her voice low but certain. "We're already too exposed as it is." The man's shoulders slumped in defeat, but just as Jake was about to signal the group to move on, a distant, guttural growl echoed from the trees behind them. The unmistakable sound of a zombie horde. The man's eyes widened in terror. "It's them. They're coming." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The horde was closer than they thought. The distant growls were now turning into an unmistakable chorus of moans and snarls. There was no time to waste. "Get ready," Jake said sharply. "We're not alone." With that, the decision was made for them. They had no choice but to fight or flee. The horde was coming, and every moment counted. The group grabbed their weapons and prepared for the fight ahead. The man, now visibly shaking, pulled a knife from his belt, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to make it through this," Jake muttered under his breath. The moment of doubt was gone. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. And the storm was coming, fast. The horde was closer now, the moans growing louder, the sound of heavy footsteps and the rustling of underbrush signaling their approach. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes scanned the dense forest surrounding them. The man who had begged for their help was now frantically looking around, his eyes darting from tree to tree. There was no time for hesitation. If they didn't act now, they'd be overwhelmed in seconds. "Get into position," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He didn't wait to see if the others responded, already moving into place. Sarah and Ben took cover behind a fallen log, weapons raised and eyes locked on the approaching threat. Jake and the stranger huddled near a large rock, readying their blades. The first zombie appeared at the edge of the clearing, its mangled body lurching forward with jerky, unnatural movements. Its eyes were glazed over, focused only on the group. It let out a guttural growl, its hands reaching out for the nearest living flesh. The stench of decay and rot wafted toward them. "Steady," Jake murmured, his grip tightening around his machete. "Wait for my signal." Another zombie appeared behind the first, then another, and another. Soon, the entire edge of the clearing was filled with the shambling undead, their arms outstretched, their grotesque faces twisted in hunger. Jake's pulse quickened, but he knew they couldn't afford to panic. They had fought before, but this time, they had a lot more to lose. The stranger was visibly shaking, his knife gripped tightly in his hand. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice quivering with fear. Jake turned to him, his eyes hard. "You do what we do, survive. Just don't get in our way." With that, Jake took a deep breath, his body tensing as the first zombie drew closer. He could feel the eyes of his group on him, waiting for the signal to attack. "Now!" Jake shouted. In an instant, chaos erupted. Jake swung his machete with practiced precision, severing the head of the nearest zombie in one clean strike. The body crumpled to the ground, but the others kept coming. Ben and Sarah opened fire, the sound of their rifles echoing through the forest as they picked off zombies one by one. The man with the knife hesitated, but then, with a sharp cry, he lunged at a zombie that had gotten too close. His aim was off, his strike wild, but it was enough to knock the zombie back. He stumbled, panic overtaking his movements, but he was alive. Ben's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "Don't let them surround you. Keep moving." Sarah's shots rang out, the crack of gunfire cutting through the air with deadly precision. Each bullet found its mark, and several zombies fell to the ground, lifeless. But for every one that dropped, two more took its place. The horde was relentless, and they were being slowly pushed back. Jake's machete slashed through the air, cutting deep into another zombie's chest. The blade bit into its flesh, but the creature barely flinched. Its blood, black and thick, splattered across Jake's shirt, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Another zombie lunged at the stranger, its mouth snapping open in a hungry snarl. The man panicked, swinging his knife wildly, but the zombie was too fast. It grabbed him by the arm, its teeth sinking into his flesh. "No!" Ben shouted, charging forward to help. With a swift strike of his spear, he drove the blade into the zombie's skull, knocking it away from the man. "Get up!" Sarah yelled, turning her rifle on another approaching threat. The stranger fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm. His face was twisted in pain, but he managed to get back to his feet, though his movements were slow and clumsy. I can't fight like this." "You don't have a choice." Jake barked, his voice filled with urgency. "We don't leave anyone behind." As the battle raged on, the tension in the clearing grew thicker. The zombies just wouldn't stop coming, and the group was growing more and more exhausted with each passing minute. The air was thick with the stench of death, the ground slick with mud and blood. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, a tree branch breaking in the distance. Jake's eyes shot toward the sound, his heart racing. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. The horde was only part of the threat. "Look out!" Ben yelled, pointing toward the shadows. Emerging from the tree line was another figure, another survivor. This time, however, the figure wasn't alone. A pack of dogs followed closely behind the person, growling low as they approached. "What the hell is this?" Sarah shouted, raising her rifle. Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked at the new arrival. This wasn't a friendly encounter, he could tell by the way the dogs snarled and bared their teeth. The new survivor didn't seem to be in charge of the pack. The dogs were circling, moving in on the group. Jake's mind raced. The distraction was enough for the zombies to press forward, but now they had to deal with a new kind of threat. The dogs were fast, vicious, and unpredictable. "Get back!" Jake ordered, his voice full of command. "The dogs will tear us apart if we don't take them out first." The battle shifted from one of survival against the undead to one of strategy and timing. The group had to fight off both the zombies and the dogs, who were closing in fast. Sarah fired at the closest dog, hitting it in the shoulder, but it kept coming, a snarl of fury escaping its mouth. Jake's machete swung again, this time toward the nearest dog. It yelped as the blade connected, but there was no time to celebrate. Another dog lunged at him from the side, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. The fight intensified. The forest had become a battlefield, with zombies on one side and wild dogs on the other, both forces closing in on the survivors. "Move!" Jake shouted as he slashed at the dog in front of him. "Keep fighting." The group was caught in the crossfire of survival. Zombies, dogs, and a world gone mad, everything was closing in. They couldn't hold out forever. But Jake wouldn't give up. Not now. Not after all they had been through. It was now or never. The world had descended into chaos. Surrounded by the undead and wild, feral dogs, the survivors found themselves fighting for their lives in a battle that seemed never-ending. Jake's grip on his machete was slipping from the sweat and blood that coated his hands, but he kept swinging, cutting down zombie after zombie. His body screamed in protest, every muscle sore from the relentless battle, but he refused to stop. The others were counting on him. "Keep pushing!" Jake shouted over the roar of battle, his voice hoarse. "We can't stop now." Ben was at his side, his spear darting in and out with precision, picking off zombies as they approached. Sarah, ever the sharpshooter, was picking off dogs and undead with lethal accuracy, her rifle cracking with every shot. But the dogs were relentless. Every time one of them went down, two more took its place, their growls rising like a storm. "Jake!" Ben yelled, ducking just in time to avoid a dog's snapping jaws. "We need to get to higher ground. This isn't working." Jake looked around, his mind racing. The clearing was quickly becoming a killing field. The group had no choice but to retreat. The only option left was to run, but they had to get to safety first. He scanned the landscape, looking for an escape route. The forest was dense, and the horde of zombies was closing in fast. But then he spotted it, a small hill just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the thick fog of the battle. "There!" Jake pointed toward the hill. "We can make it to higher ground. Move!" Without hesitation, the group began to move, cutting through the chaos. Zombies lurched at them from all directions, but they fought their way through, slashing and shooting with precision. The dogs were still hot on their heels, snarling and snapping at their legs, but they kept pushing forward, desperation fueling every step. The stranger, still clutching his bleeding arm, stumbled behind them. He was slow, his movements shaky, but he was alive. And that meant something. "Come on, hurry!" Jake urged, looking over his shoulder. The undead were getting closer. The pack of dogs was relentless, their growls deafening as they closed in on the group. One of the dogs lunged at Sarah, but she was ready, her rifle raised. She fired, hitting the dog square in the chest. It fell, but only for a moment. Another dog immediately took its place. The group reached the base of the hill, but the ground was slick with blood, mud, and the heavy rain from the previous night. Sarah slipped, but Ben grabbed her arm, pulling her back to her feet just as a dog lunged at them. The two of them fought the dog off, but time was running out. Jake reached the top of the hill first, his legs burning with exhaustion. He turned, watching as the others made their way up. The zombies were closer now, their relentless moans filling the air. The dogs were nearly at their heels. "Get up here, now!" Jake shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. But just as Ben reached the top, a terrifying growl echoed from behind them. A larger, more vicious dog, its eyes gleaming with hunger, broke through the trees, its powerful legs carrying it toward them with frightening speed. It was faster than the others, a beast more capable of ripping them apart. "Ben! Watch out!" Sarah yelled, but it was too late. The dog lunged at Ben, its jaws snapping around his leg, pulling him down to the ground with a sickening thud. "Ben!" Sarah screamed. Jake didn't hesitate. He threw his machete with all his strength, the blade slicing through the air and embedding itself into the dog's skull. It fell with a yelp, but Ben was already struggling, his face contorted in pain. "Help him!" Sarah shouted, already moving toward Ben. Jake and Sarah both rushed to Ben's side, pulling him toward the hill as the rest of the group gathered around. The bigger dog was down, but the zombies and other dogs were closing in. They had to get higher ground, and fast. We need to hold them off, Jake said urgently, his mind racing. Get to the top. I'll cover you. No, Sarah said firmly, her eyes sharp with determination. We stick together. No one gets left behind. Jake met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of the decision seemed too heavy to bear. But then he nodded. She was right. They had to fight together, or not at all. They made a quick plan. Sarah would provide cover, taking down any zombies or dogs that ventured too close. Ben, despite his injury, would help defend the top of the hill, using his spear. Jake would take the front, using his machete to cut down any that came too close. With weapons raised, they braced themselves for the final wave. Zombies and dogs were nearly upon them, and the battle for survival had reached its peak. But Jake refused to give in. They had fought too hard to die now. The zombies staggered forward, their grotesque bodies pushing forward with relentless hunger. Jake slashed through them, his machete cutting through the air with deadly precision. Ben and Sarah were on either side, using every weapon at their disposal to hold the line. The sound of gunfire rang out, followed by the sickening thud of zombies hitting the ground. The dogs growled, circling, but they couldn't reach the survivors. They fought with everything they had left. And then, finally, after what felt like hours, the last zombie fell. The last dog was dead. The forest was silent again, save for the heavy breathing of the group. They had made it. Jake collapsed to his knees, exhaustion sweeping over him in waves. He could barely lift his head, but he knew they had survived. They had fought for every inch of land, and they had earned their victory. Ben, bleeding but still conscious, gave a weak smile. We did it. Sarah nodded, her face grim. For now. Jake looked out across the battlefield, the horde of zombies lying lifeless on the ground. The dogs were gone, and the survivors were battered, bruised, and broken, but they were alive. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself a brief moment of hope. They had won. They had fought, and they had survived. And that, in this world, was all that mattered. The fight for survival would continue, but for now, they had secured their place in the dead America.